I had stumbled across an interesting data point that showed our customers didn't really value our shipping policy as much as we thought they would. So fast forward a couple weeks later, I'm in the boardroom. I get to the data point and he looks at it a moment and then he says, bullshit. That wasn't what I was expecting to hear from him. I wasn't expecting outright denial and just shooting it down. I got out of the room relatively unscathed, but what died that day was nobody picked up that data point. Nobody touched it because he basically shot it down.
Welcome to the Data Career Podcast, the podcast that helps aspiring data professionals land their next data job. Here's your host, Avery Smith.
Welcome back to the Data Career Podcast, everyone. I am here with a great guest. We have Brent Dykes, who is the author of Effective Data Storytelling, a great book about how to tell stories with data. We're going to get into all of that conversation today. So, Brent, thank you for joining us here.
Happy to be here, Avery.
Okay, I wanted to start with actually the way you start the book as well. So, do you
Sure.
mind telling us the story of your, an eager-eyed, bushy-tailed, a young, whippersnapper professional ready to share, earlier in your career, ready to share some amazing insights that you found and kind of what happened in that story?
Yeah, I was a MBA intern. I was one of multiple MBA interns all working at a direct to retail catalog retailer. And so we all had to present to a SVP of e-commerce. And this wasn't your typical executive. He was actually a former special forces helicopter pilot and very intimidating, very stern, intelligent individual. He had reduced other MBA students to tears during their presentations. So had a very tough reputation. And so I was just preparing for a midpoint presentation to kind of give him an update on where we were, or I was, and the other MBAs as well. And I had stumbled across an interesting data point that showed that our customers, or at least the customers filling out the survey, didn't really value our shipping policy as much as we thought they would. And we highly valued our shipping policy at this e-commerce site. And so I thought this was interesting. I thought, wow, this is something I should share. Now the caveat was it wasn't directly related to my project. So I debated whether I should even include it. And I said, you know what? I'm going to include it because it's something, I need to provide this information to this executive and his other managers and directors. So I was like, okay, I'm going to include it. So fast forward a couple weeks later, I'm in the boardroom. He's in the middle, other directors and managers are around the table. I get to the data point about the customer feedback on our shipping policy. And he looks at it a moment and then he says bullshit. And that wasn't what I was expecting to hear from him. I was kind of expecting, oh, that's interesting, Brett. Oh, where did you get that data point? Or, is there any other data or explanation? Or maybe we should take a closer look at that. Or, that's kind of what I was expecting. I wasn't expecting, outright denial and just shooting it down. So I was a little bit flustered at that point. Luckily, I had a mentor who jumped in, gave me some cover fire, and I got out of the room relatively unscathed. But what died that day and what taught me a very valuable lesson, it was nobody picked up that data point. Nobody looked at that customer data. Nobody touched it because he basically shot it down. And it taught me that when I have something important to communicate, when I have a data point or an insight that needs to be shared and understood, I need to do a better job communicating it. And that kind of led me into this world of data storytelling because I felt, you know what, there's got to be a better way to communicate insights. There's got to be a way to do this more effectively so that our insights go places and do things rather than just dying on the boardroom floor.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, if you want someone to have a takeaway or to understand or to be open to any sort of an idea or an insight you have, telling a story helps them kind of become more accepting to that idea, right?
Yeah, no, there's psychology has shown that when you approach somebody with a data or fact, our defense mechanisms go up. We don't want to be tricked. We don't want to be deceived. We're kind of more skeptical. It may not jive in that example, right? It was counterintuitive to this executive. He was very proud of the shipping policy. There's no way that this information or data could be true. And so often what happens is when we approach people with facts or data, they're going to, they're very defensive. Whereas if you approach somebody with a story, people are much more open-minded. They kind of drop their analytical guard. They're not going to nitpick on the details as much. And they want to hear where the story goes. And so there are certain advantages that we get from sharing stories, and it's in our DNA. We love to share stories and we love to hear stories, and so it's almost like in my book I talk about having an express highway. If you think about all the data that gets clogged up in our brains, and it's hard to process and stuff. A story is kind of that express lane, the HOV lane in our brains that gets the information much more quickly, much more effectively than other means which we have, which aren't around storytelling.
And now, everyone listening, you just experienced a great example of storytelling because Brent and I could have gotten on here, right? And I could have been like, Brent, like, what's up with storytelling? And you could have said, oh yeah, storytelling is way better than just showing a graph or just saying some sort of an insight or something that you take away. It's way better, and that could have been your whole point. But to illustrate that point, you told a story, and so now I challenge everyone listening: try to forget that story. Try, a day from now, try to not remember this military general standing in the middle of the boardroom, yelling explicit things to poor intern Brent as he just tries to present his simple analysis about customer service. You can't forget it. But if we would have just said, yeah, storytelling is important, you could have forgotten it. The idea is stories really get your point across and you become memorable and stand out when you tell those types of stories.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, there was a study done where so in a book called Made to Stick, it was written by Chip and Dan Heath on communication. And one of the things they talk about, they share this example from Chip Heath. He teaches a course at Stanford University, and it's on communication. And one of the activities that he puts the students through is he gives them a bunch of data on a topic and asks them to take a position and build a short presentation on it. And he asks them to include some of these data points or statistics that he's given them. And so on average, the students use about two and a half of the statistics, but then 1 in 10 of the students will actually incorporate an anecdote or an example or story as part of their pitch. And so they divide up into groups of, I don't know how many students, like 4 or 5 students each group, and they present to each other, they rate each other, give feedback. They think the exercise is over. And then 10 minutes later, the professor comes back to them and says, okay, how many of you remember any of the statistics that were shared? And then what they found was only 5% of them could remember any of the statistics. But then if there was a story shared, 63% of them could remember the story. And so if we think of our human brains and how we're constantly trying to make sense of the world around us, and it's really about packaging the information, making sense of it. And that's what a story does, right? It's prepackaged. Here's everything you need to understand the meaning behind something. And so that's why we want to take our data points, our information that we have, package it as a story. And now you've got something that's memorable, that's persuasive. It's super powerful.
I love what you said there, that the packaging matters because it's easy to think, well, my analysis is my analysis. It's true. Like I crunched the numbers, I pulled them straight from the SQL database. I made the Tableau, graphic all by myself. Like this is fact. And it could be, like it literally could be the fact. The thing that people often miss is, well, facts and stats and lines of code don't actually make the world go round. Humans do. Like humans are still running companies. There's not like AI robots. Like you have to be able to convince humans that like, hey, this is the stuff that matters. This is why it matters. This is why it's important. This is why it's true. Even though you don't maybe think it is or you don't want it to think it is, like you still have to be able to convince them, these humans, that these things are correct. And so your packaging, like literally the insight stays the exact same. The truth is the truth, but you really have to like wrap a bow around it, put it in some Christmas paper around it, I don't know, wrapping paper, and like present it with a bow to people and be like, hey, here's my insight. The insight can be the insight inside. Wow, that's a tongue twister. Could literally be the exact same thing. And the outside could really be almost some technical people like, I don't even know if this is the right word. I don't even know if this is a word, but like superficial. Like it doesn't seem like it adds any value, but the packaging adds a ton of value, right? Like that's what you're saying is like, if you just get a Christmas present in a grocery bag, it doesn't feel as good if you get a Christmas present in a big box, really neatly wrapped up together.
Yeah, and it's much more than just decorations or different things that we're adding on to this. I mean, one of the critical mistakes that I see a lot of people make is that, if you've spent a lot of time analyzing the data, you're very familiar with what's going on in the numbers speak to you, right? And it feels like the story's coming out so clearly. But what we forget is that we've spent a lot of time analyzing the data. spent days or weeks or months analyzing these numbers, and we're very intimately knowledgeable of the context of where this data came from, what it means, what the metrics mean, everything. And when we put out a dashboard or we put out a report or a graph art, and we put it in, an email or send it to somebody, we're just like, this makes complete sense to us as the originators of this analysis. But on the receiving end, to them, it's like, okay, what is it I'm looking at? I don't have the context. I don't know what these numbers are. I don't know all the ins and outs of what I'm looking at. And we make that assumption that it's so clear to us that it's clear to everybody else. And that's the key thing. We need to transition from that analysis, phase that we go through. And then when we make the decision that we have to share this information with other people, we then have to shift gears, change our approach and say, okay, how do we explain this to other people? How do we make this content readily understandable to other people who haven't there, if you're presenting to an executive, we can't expect them to spend days in the data like we did. No, you've got 5 minutes, you've got 10 minutes, 20 minutes with them to kind of quickly get to a point and explain something to them. And yeah, you're not going to go through all the weeds. You're going to give the key elements that they need to understand the problem or the opportunity with the data you're providing wrapped in a story. And and that's the magic. We're packaging up the insights in a way that are going to be understood. They're memorable, they're engaging. I mean, they're persuasive, they're going to persuade people to act. I mean, that's why we take this extra effort to really, tell stories with our data.
And I think that's such a good point because there's even people who may be listening to this that aren't quite a data analyst yet, but they're on their way. They're aspiring. They're trying to break into the data world. And a lot of the times I see, their resume or I see their portfolio or a project they've made. And it's like a lot of the times they'll just send me like a Git repo link
Mhm.
or even just like a GitHub profile link. And I'm like,
Right.
man, I have to click like 7 times before I see anything like that I actually really care about. And then when I click on
Right.
that seventh thing, it's like 150 lines of SQL code. And this is where I think you talk about in your book, knowing your audience is really important, where it's like a
Mhm.
recruiter or a hiring manager, in this case, or in real life, like a CEO or a manager, they don't care about the 150 lines that you wrote in SQL. They care about the results. So if you can, give them a brief introduction to the data, right? If you can kind of give your main point, then kind of show a little bit about what you did and the results, that's really what they care about. But you have to craft that in a certain way. And I think if I'm not mistaken, you have like I don't even know the right phrase, like a framework that you kind of do with this sort of data storytelling. I think it's let me see, 6 essential elements of a data story. Does that sound familiar?
Mhm. Do you want me to go through them or?
Yeah, I think so. I think I have them written down. You can tell me if this is right or wrong. But I have it as the data foundation, the main
Yep.
point, the explanatory focus, linear sequence, dramatic elements, and visual anchors. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me go through those. Pull out my books here and just make sure I hit them in order here. So the first one being data foundation, right? So these are kind of like the essential elements that you'll find in every data story and what makes a data story special. So the first thing being the data foundation. And obviously we're not telling fictional stories. We're not making it's not a creative exercise. Our foundation is in data. We're being inspired to create a story from facts and data that we found. So that's kind of like the first thing, right? And when we think about a data story, I use the analogy of chocolate. Like, so obviously you want to have good quality chocolate, right? There's probably many of you have had really bad brown colored chocolate that's not doesn't feel like it came from a cow. It's highly manufactured and pretty gross. And it's the same thing with our data storage, right? We have to have a good foundation of good quality. We want to don't want to just have sprinkles of chocolate in our chocolate chip cookies. We want to have lots big chunks of chocolate, right? So I mean, I'm using an analogy here, but basically we want to have good a good portion of data in our stories, and we want to make sure that it's trustworthy, reliable, relevant. Those are key things. And then the next point is you got to have a main point, right? What is that main point you're trying to make with your story? If there's one thing that your audience remembers from your story, what is it? and usually in my terminology that I use, I talk about the aha moment being that one key insight that you want people to remember. So that's important. With a data story, you got to have a direction. There's got to be a destination. You're not just spouting off random facts and interesting data points. No, there's got to be a purpose. There's a flow. There's a destination that we're taking people on. The explanatory focus, that's the next thing. So I've already talked about how when you're exploring the data, you're looking at data a certain way, but then once we transition to storytelling, it's really about explaining the information. And so we're very big on making sure that things are clear and understandable to the audience. The next thing is a linear sequence is another key element, right? So there's a kind of a sequencing that we take people through. We start with maybe a setting, establishing the status quo. This is what we typically see in our data. And then there's a hook. And for me, that's where maybe there's a key metric that goes up or a key metric that goes down, and that gets the audience interested. So going from the setting to the hook, and then we start to connect the dots for the audience, going all the way to our big insight. And then we're not done at that point because we want to help drive action. So that's where we want to make sure that they know what to do. Here we've found like, hey, there's a $5 million savings that we can potentially get, by making some changes to our processes or whatever. And then it's like, well, what are the options? How do we, what are the steps we need to take to get this $5 million opportunity? So there's a sequencing, and that's a key part of a story. I think sometimes gets lost, right? So some people will say, oh, dashboards tell data stories. Well, that sequencing is really difficult with a data store or with a dashboard, unless you're actually laying it out in a certain manner in which, okay, look here, then here, then here, then here. Often with a dashboard, we kind of look over there, and then there's different, things going, and there's really not that linear sequencing that's important. And then the next thing is the dramatic elements. And so I really believe that with a storytelling, you got to have that narrative arc, right? So there's this narrative arc that's a part of all the films and the TV shows and the movies and the novels. I mean, obviously there's variations in terms of what people do with that narrative arc. But a traditional narrative arc is, you kind of introduce the characters. There's some kind of inciting incident that occurs, and then tension builds as that hero or the main character starts to go on some kind of journey or transformation, and then they reach a climax, like, where they're battling the foe or the villain, and then there's kind of a resolution at the end where everything's kind of made finalized and made whole. So definitely bringing in those narrative dramatic elements into storytelling. There's a lot of parallels that we can borrow certain things from other forms of storytelling that you typically wouldn't associate them with data, but we can definitely lean into those elements. So that's the dramatic elements, and then there's the visual anchors. And a lot of times we are relying on charts and graphics to kind of show movements and trends and patterns and anomalies in the data. If we just talked about them, we can, but often when we visualize them, they come across to an audience much more powerfully than if we just said, here's the data, or here's a table with all the numbers, go through it yourself. No, like if we plot those out, we actually visualize the trends. It's going to be much more powerful, much more meaningful, and much more accessible too. You think about people, having to go through rows and rows of data to kind of interpret what's going on. Whereas we can plot those out in a graph of some kind. And then, almost instantly people can see, oh my gosh, we've got a huge gap here, or we've got a huge spike going on, or whatever it is in the data, they can see it. And it can enlighten them to things in the numbers that they would otherwise miss.
That's so interesting, and I love those 6 elements. That it's like, you gotta be truthful, you gotta have your main point up front, and then you gotta, craft a unique story. And I was gonna ask, like, well, what's an example of a bad data story? But to me, in that answer, you almost hit it, and it's not so much, there's probably a lot less bad data stories rather than people just not telling the story at all and just kinda giving, here's my insight, here's my dashboard. Is that true? That's probably the mistake that a lot of people end up making?
Yeah, because of data dump. It's like, oh, I found something interesting. Here's something, and here's something, and here's more. and they just want to make sure that people have enough information to make a decision, but there's really no, you've got to kind of like filter out some of the information. If it's just a fire hose of here's all the data that I looked at, all the data, interesting things that I found, and then leave it up to your audience to kind of make connect the dots. That's really hard for them to do. And so we need to make that effort to kind of do the dot connecting, the interpretation, helping them to see and make sense of the number, and when we do a bad job of that, that's because we haven't communicated it clearly. Maybe we haven't visualized the information in a way that's helpful to the audience. Maybe we're including information that's not related or relevant. Again, we're trying to be focused with a data story. We're trying to be very focused on what's going to be meaningful, what's going to, we talk about actionable insights. We really want to help people take action from the data and use it to make better decisions or smarter actions. And if we're not taking the time to go through those numbers and really distill down what are the what are the action, what's the value? I mean, one of the biggest questions you're going to get when you're presenting data to an executive is, so what? Right? You found this insight, but there's also another element. So what? And then that's okay. Well, it seems like we do have a problem with, whatever it is, maybe with our product rollouts, right? You've identified a gap in our product rollouts. So what? What do we, what's the impact of this problem? And then we can then say, if we've done our analysis and we've built a story around, we probably explored, well, if we don't fix this product rollout problem, we're gonna miss, we're gonna undersell, maybe we do some kind of like predictive analysis, or we've done some kind of forecasting of, we have 5 more product rollouts this year. If each of them underperforms like this last one did, because we didn't have a good process, that means we're going to miss our targets by 25%, by 40%, whatever it is. That means, hey, that means $20 million, or that means $30 million. I mean, these are big numbers I'm talking about here, but it can be much smaller or bigger depending on where you're focused. But at the end of the day, people are going to care about the so what, not just the numbers or the data. And we need to put our insights in context.
Such a good point, because a lot of the times when I see student people ask me to look at their projects, and I'm a busy guy. Like, I mean, I definitely try to keep busy, right? And so it's not like I have all
Yeah.
day to be looking at projects. When I open up a project, and this could be project for people who maybe haven't landed a job yet, or at work if you're presenting some sort of project you've done, like the person you're presenting to is probably busy. When they open that up, it's like, okay, tell me why I should care. It's kind of like the thumbnail on a YouTube video, or the movie poster, or the trailer for a movie. It's like, prove to me why I should invest 3 hours of my time in this movie. And that's the same thing with a data project. It's like, why should I spend the next 25 minutes, reading all this stuff, looking at these slides, looking at your code? You kind of have to prove it to me. And so there's this framework that I've kind of stolen. I can't remember who I stole it from, so I apologize to them. But it's called the 10-1-10 rule. And basically, it means whenever you're presenting anything, you have 10 seconds to make an impression. If you've made an impression after 10 seconds, they will give a minute of their time. If you make a good impression after that minute, they're going to spend 10 more minutes on that. So I really talk about that mostly with resumes, but it's the same thing with the data project. It's like, if you want me to sit here, you have to like entice me. And so I think the thing you kind of talked about was the main point being that aha moment. I think that's a great
Mhm.
name for it. Sometimes I hear people name it bluff, bottom line up front, or the TLDR, which I think stands for too long, didn't read. Like, it's like usually a one sentence summary. It's like, if I didn't read this, what's my main takeaway? And really, if you don't have that, it doesn't matter how good the analysis is, people might not get to it. And that's problematic,
Right.
because then they won't take action, and then there's really no impact. Does that make sense?
Yeah. 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 And there is, I mean, there's a couple of communication approaches that can come in handy. And obviously, an executive summary, a summarization of your project can be very valuable. And that's really where you're not really telling a story. You're basically saying, here are the highlights, here are the things that you will get out of this project. And then people can then decide if they want to see more information. A storytelling approach is a little different, where you're not giving away maybe the climax at the beginning of the movie, right? You're going to be like building up to the key thing to kind of get people interested in hearing your story is a hook. And that's where you're like, hey, here's a problem I've identified. Here's I found that many students are not doing their homework or whatever it is, and it's 50% of students are not doing their, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it was that high, and now you've got the attention of the audience because they're like, well, what's going on? What's causing that? And then you dig into, well, here are the three reasons why students are not doing their homework, or what's contributing to their inability to complete their assignments or whatever. And then you build up to your aha moment. So that there's a difference. I think there are use cases for where a summary is where you put your main point first up front, and then it's up to the audience to decide whether they want to hear more or not. And then the storytelling approach is more building up to that main point. So on one hand, a summary is very efficient, right? It gets to the point very quickly. And probably in job scenarios and different things, you have to do that manner because you're not going to get more than 10 seconds or a minute. And so you got to kind of summarize very quickly. If you have more time, the benefit of a story, and I would say probably stories are happening once you've got the interview, right? Because what are you going to be doing in an interview? You're going to be telling stories. You're going to be telling stories about, whether this is your first job and you're working on projects in college or whatever, or in whatever boot camp or whatever you've been doing. You're going to be talking about those assignments, those projects, telling stories about what you did and what interesting things you learned and how they could be beneficial to this client or to this company. And so the power of your storytelling will be very critical for you to get a job because they're going to be listening to your stories of what your skills are and your interests and all that. So, you know, summarization and storytelling go together, but summarization is about efficiency, storytelling is about effectiveness.
I love it. I love the interview aspect you brought up because I think a lot of people wouldn't think of an interview as a chance to tell your story. But really, at the end of the day, like an interview's job is to understand who you are as a person, and also like if you look at from the inter perspective, is to stand out. And we just talked about like if you want something to be memorable, tell a story. And if you want someone
Right.
to know about you, like telling a story, so I just think that's such a brilliant way to look at an interview of like, okay, in this interview, of course, I'm going to be answering their questions. We also know that like a lot of the times you're going to get asked behavioral questions. Best way to answer behavioral questions is with the STAR method, the situation, task, action, result, which is really just the story method. It's like, tell me a story
Mhm.
when you actually did this and how did it go? So there's kind of like you'll be answering the behavioral questions with stories, but then also in the first question that you're going to be asked literally every single interview, tell me about yourself. That's basically, in other words, they could be saying, "Tell me your story." And that's probably how you
Mhm.
should be answering it if you want to stand out, which I think is so captivating and so much better than, "Oh, I'm Avery. I've worked as a data analyst for this company and this company. Yeah, that's me." Right? I don't think that's very exciting.
It's not going to make you stand out, right? I mean, that's the great thing about stories is they're memorable. There's a stack of resumes on this recruiter's desk, or on their hard drive, and you want to stand out. And so I would say 100%. If you invested in thinking about what stories, it's not about like, okay, what were all the, how many lines of code did I write in SQL, or how many, all of these, you know, data related statistics about your capabilities or skills and how many certifications you have and blah, blah, blah. No, like think about how can do I have a story that it illustrates my curiosity? Do I have a story that illustrates my ability to attention to detail? Do I have a story that highlights my tenacity? That's what you need to come prepared, and you need to have those in your brain ready to go. And when the recruiter or the hiring manager gives you an opportunity to, hey, can you tell me about, this project, or give me a project that you worked on recently. And then not only do you give them a project or her a project, you package it up as selling one of your core features, one of your distinguishing capabilities or differentiating personality or characteristics that's gonna, it's gonna, that's gonna, you're gonna sink hook into them. They're gonna, if you tell the right story and you all of a sudden, you're gonna stand out. You're gonna be that much more relatable. I would say try and tell as many of these short stories. Obviously, you can't take 15 minutes to tell a story. You have in this, if you have a half hour interview, you're going to want to hit as many of these succinct 1 or 2 minute stories, maybe up to 3 minutes, and pack it in as many as you can. And you're going to be that memorable candidate that gets it to the second round or gets the job.
It can really make the difference, I feel like, which is quite
Mhm.
impressive. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was the 3 pillars of, data storytelling. We have the data, you have the narrative, and you have the
Mhm.
visuals, which is what you talk about
Right.
in your book. And when we're kinda talking before we started to hit record, I was mentioning that a lot of people mistake your book for a data visualization book, probably at least in part because of due to another really popular data book called Storytelling with Data that is, I would say, 90% visualization based, 10% story based. And then I would say your book is much closer to a 50-50 split. And so we were kind of having this discussion. And one of the things that you had mentioned was like you definitely want to have all three. You want to have data, you want to have narrative, you want to have visuals. But like I could tell a data story without the visuals. And so I just thought that'd be an interesting challenge. Maybe we'll have to have you back on the
Mhm.
podcast someday. We'll do a whole Brent episode with telling a data story with no visuals, just audio. But do you think it's possible to tell stories without the visuals?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm the expert on audio data stories without visualizations. I am very dependent on using visuals, but I recognize the power of storytelling or data storytelling without visuals. And I'll give you an example. If you've listened to any of like the Daily from New York Times or
Hmm.
many of these podcasts out there, they're telling very rich data stories without any visualizations, and so they're giving facts and data and weaving in, humanizing the numbers and telling stories and examples and dropping facts at the same time, and probably facts are a part of a core spine within those stories, but there are no visuals being shared. There's no charts. It's just all data points and narrative mixed together on these podcasts. And so yeah, again, the one that comes to mind is The Daily by the New York Times. Excellent. They do lots of very investigative narrative journalist kind of approach. And so they are rich in data and narrative, but because of the medium, there are no visuals. And so, they're doing it in a certain way. So when I look at the visuals, I mean, obviously visualization has been synonymous with data storytelling for a long time. And I felt like that wasn't really the best characterization of what data storytelling is all about, right? So if we look at the three pillars, data, absolutely, like we're not making up fictional stories here, kind of like with my six, the first one being data foundation. It's the same thing. It's data is at the core of a data story. Without data, it's just a fictional story. It's not based on facts. So absolutely data is critical. And in fact, it's not like we've created, like we want to tell us, we've got a narrative in mind and we're like, okay, I want to cherry pick this data point to then form a story. No, we're starting with data, we're doing analysis, we're finding something, and then we're building a story on that. Now, the next thing, a data story can't be a data story without a narrative, right? So the narrative component, and we have to think about what makes a story, right? There's a certain arc to it. There's a certain, I talked about some of those principles, the linear sequencing and different things. And obviously, narrative touches us in a different way on an emotional level that, facts and data just really connect with us from a logical perspective or reasoning perspective. But the emotional part of that comes through on the storytelling, on the narrative. Now, the third element, visuals, in my mind, visuals are there to help us tell our story with the data. So it's almost like I almost feel like the visualization is a supporting mechanism for because we are sharing data and often a lot of the times it's super beneficial to be able to visualize the data with charts and graphs. That's why it's there because it's a facilitating, a supporting element, but often, like again, I shared the audio podcast as a way that you can tell data stories without visuals. But often, like in business and in different things, we're going to be relying on charts and visualizations to really communicate. the very complex data sets that we're working with and trends and patterns and different things, anomalies that we're seeing in the data are going to be, you're going to be able to see them with the charts and with the visualizations. But again, I see them as a means to an end. And that's probably different than the current, beliefs out there about data storytelling. I place a lot of emphasis on the narrative for a reason, because I feel like when I do surveys of different audiences that I speak to, and I ask them which of the three pillars, data, narrative, and visuals, is the most challenging for you, and quite often it's almost like 2/3 of the people believe that narrative is the area that they struggle with the most. And so for me, that's great to hear, because that's what I wrote my book for. I believe in the importance of the data. I believe in the importance of the visuals. But for me, I felt like the gap, or the thing that the element that was being overlooked, was the narrative. And that's really where a lot of the power comes from. Like, obviously I believe in the information that we get from the data, but definitely the emotional power, the engaging, memorable, persuasive component of data stories comes from the narrative. And so that's why, it was definitely an intentional core focus of my book.
You guys can find Brent's book, Effective Data Storytelling. I have a copy. I think it's absolutely great. We'll have a link to it in the show notes down below. And then, Brent, where can people go to learn more about you?
Yeah, you can go to effectivedatastorytelling.com. And so I'm there. You can learn more about the book if you're interested in learning more. Also, I'm on LinkedIn. So look at me on LinkedIn. I do 3 posts a week. Basically every week I do 3 posts. And I've also got a newsletter. So you can go to my corporate website, hero.com, and sign up for my newsletter. And then that's where I share tips and tricks on data storytelling, talking about analytics and data culture. Those are some of the topics I like to write about.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brent. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Avery.